Hello, and welcome to our event. My name is Stella Rooney, and I'm going to be facilitating this event today. So welcome to our strike class, and this is part of the Ignorant Art School series, which is a series of sit-ins organised by the Cooper Gallery. This one particularly is going to accompany Ruth Ewan's work, which is we'll be able to view in the Cooper Gallery once it opens up again. We have adopted the language of protest for this series. So this is part of this session is part of our curriculum, which will go alongside the artwork. But in this event today, we're going to be thinking about Timex, which is a very evocative word in Dundee. It's steeped in history. It's part of the fabric of the city. My name is Stella Rooney. I'm an artist and trade unionist, and I'm going to be facilitating the discussion tonight. Timex is of real personal interest to me. I spent last year of my undergraduate degree researching it, the dispute, the history of the factory, the people, the legend of Timex, the legacy. And the reason I was drawn to Timex is because I feel it represents a world of work which it's entirely different now for people of my generation. There are no longer enough jobs to go round, and decent unionised jobs have become a rarity. Timex was a key turning point in this trajectory. The rise of the service economy, the decline of trade union membership is the world that we have inherited at the moment. But history shows us that this is not inevitable. It doesn't have to be this way. In recent years, we have seen a reinvigorated trade union movement and tenants union movement in Scotland. We have seen union membership begin to rise, particularly in young people and women workers. So I think that the Timex, as a factory, as a legacy, as the 1993 dispute, it raises many pertinent questions around solidarity, community, and political education through struggle. Tonight, we're going to have a stab at investigating some of these questions, and by pulling our collective knowledge together, I hope we can provide some insight into breaking down some of these big political questions. We have a short interval. We also have the opportunity at the end for the audience to ask questions. And I would really encourage you to leave your comments and questions in the chat box and join in the conversation. Shortly we'll begin the discussion event with our two panellists, but to introduce the conversation, we're going to screen a short film which I have made for this event, and I hope that will provoke some thoughts, some discussion, some memories possibly.
Dundee, like many cities, is surrounded by ghosts. This is where a factory once stood, and here too. We made Dundee with our own hands, even when there were no jobs left. In a Dundee tradition of working class struggle, the Timex dispute was a political education for all those involved, from the workers to the wider Dundee community and far beyond. It was a moment in time when watches were broken and stopped in Dundee, but a precious moment too, as a symbol of working class bravery and solidarity. The backbone of the dispute was the female workforce, good-humoured, feisty, beautiful, brave Dundee women who would make their voices heard, who would not be dismissed. Let's look under the face of the clock. We had a workforce who were proud of their skills and their continuing ability to adapt to technology as it advanced. And there was a sense that these skills were valued until they learned that the boss's only value was the speediest route to profit. We learned the fickle power of multinational and transnational companies. We learned that those in power will use and abuse us, but that we have something in our solidarity that they cannot even comprehend. That workers can support workers, that other workplaces can join in, that a city and then more towns and cities and individuals and communities and organisations can stand side by side to say no to injustice. Courage I'll show in the face of adversity. Though traitors surround me, I'll still remain true. What though our enemies hate and revile me, I'll keep my ideals fresh as the dew.
I'm sure there were some familiar faces in that video, and I'd like to thank the Timex History Group and Jim McFarlane as well for providing some of the images that were featured in that film. So I'd just like to introduce some of our speakers that are going to be participating in the discussion. Our first of our speakers, our panelists, is Charlie Malone. Charlie was the chair of the 1993 Strike Committee. He's also a lecturer and a counsellor in Lochee. And Mary McGregor is a retired English and guidance teacher and a lifelong political activist. She also provided the voiceover for the film that we've just watched. So we're going to start the discussion by and thinking about perhaps there's people here who don't know anything about Timex and are just interested in it. To introduce the discussion, I'll start with Charlie first and then go to Mary, but what is your own personal connection to Timex?
Like many young men, and it was mainly men, but there were breakthroughs for women to go on to become apprentices at Timex. And so the first 2 female apprentices in Scotland in engineering were actually Timex workers. So, but it was typical working class males like myself that when you were at school, you were told, you were almost conditioned to believe that there was no point in you thinking about university as a career because you were working class and the place for you would be the factories. And almost like there was a gender thing about young men in particular getting apprenticeships. And it was always one of these things that Timex was a great provider of apprenticeships. But I can honestly say it was someplace I'd never, ever wanted to go. I never wanted to be an engineer. I actually wanted to be a cartographer, a map drawer. But my father said that's not a job for a man. So again, it was that working class culture around apprenticeships, and engineering was the thing. I often think about it, and I remember my first days in Timex. I remember my first day in Timex walking into the factory, and I've always said it was like going from colour to black and white at a grayscale. I went from the playground of Lawside Academy into a factory, and in that factory, the first thing I got handed was a grey overall. The windows were blacked out, the machinery was grey, and it was almost like the life had been sucked out of you going into that. But what I learned through my 16 years association with Timex was something quite beautiful. And that was the community and solidarity that exists, the humour that exists, no matter how oppressive the regime that you operate in, no matter how ugly the jobs are or repetitive the jobs are. It's that sense of being with people like you and sharing the humour, sharing the understanding of your lives. And I think that's quite beautiful. And it's actually a privilege to have met people. And I think some of the images you showed there, Stella, were quite moving. And the voiceover is quite moving. And I'm actually quite emotional thinking about it now. But as somebody who joined, as I said, as a 17-year-old lad at Lochee, I could never have anticipated what was before me. And it was only before me because the people I worked with and some of the legends who schooled me in political education in Timex.
Mary, what was your connection to Timex?
I came to Dundee in 1975. I grew up in the Raploch in Stirling, which was a housing estate. And my dad was a mine worker. He was a joiner at the pit at Paul Mays. So when I came to Dundee, I'd had an understanding of struggle and class because my dad had been involved in the miners' strikes, etc. So when I came here, I was involved in student politics, and then I became involved in local politics in the city. I got involved with Timex through the Timex support group, but like everybody else in Dundee, anybody that stayed in Dundee for any length of time, I knew folk that worked in Timex. I had friends who had family who worked in Timex. We all kind of knew of each other. And if you were involved in politics, some of the political people that I knew were also workers in the Timex factory. So when the dispute started, I became part of this Timex support group. And that was my involvement, my biggest involvement with the factory through the support group. And our role at that time was to support the strike, followed by the lockout, because it's, as Charlie points out, it's important to remember that the workers were on strike for a short period of time, and then they were locked out by the management for the rest of that time. And so we did fundraisers and events, but we also built support groups right across the country. I met my husband on the picket line, who had come up from London to be part of a mass demonstration. And he was part of the London Timex support group, who were also organising benefits and concerts and trying to raise awareness of what was happening at that time.
That's amazing that you met your husband from London on a picket line.
Yeah, I still got him.
Yeah, he liked Dundee that much, he never left.
That's right.
I was wondering as well, so see for people who have no idea about Timex, how would you describe what did Timex make, how many people worked there, but what was the feeling of people who worked there and the kind of connection to the overall community in Dundee?
I think there was a real pride. Timex came to Dundee in the late 1940s. The Labour government after the Second World War was looking to spread investment across the UK, and they advised Timex to come to Dundee. And it started as a very small watchmaking operation and became one of the biggest employers in Dundee, with almost 5,000 people at its peak working in Timex. And I think that's where Mary comes from, the position that everybody knew somebody that worked in Timex. It's often said that Timex was good for Dundee, but to quote Gordon Sampson, one of the conveners of Timex, Timex was good for, Dundee was good for Timex.
Yeah.
We created the wealth. Timex went on to become the biggest manufacturer of mechanical watches in the world, taking about 30% of the overall market. And we were central to that production. We were central to that success. So I guess it grew from being a very small operation into a massive operation that every single person could identify with in the city. But it wasn't just Timex that was like that. We had other institutions like NCR, like Levi's, like Michelin. They were icons of their time, when everybody understood that industrial age where we could all identify with people in our community who work for these organizations. And I think that's where my appreciation came from. I didn't appreciate it until I started there, but it was just the strength of cross-community roots and cross-industrial roots, where people understood the problems and challenges being faced by other people in different factories, in different industries, in different sectors, whether that be the miners to the nurses, and that we shared that sense of common solidarity, and everybody's struggle was the same. So I think that Timex proved to be a huge vehicle for that in the city, but we shouldn't discount other industries and other people in the city as well at the same time, because this was an evolution of struggle. It was a broad evolution of struggle. And when we look at some of the changes that have happened in the industrial landscape, from the Equal Pay Act, after the women at Dagenham fought, took industrial action in order to secure social change, that's what it's about. It may be about short-term wages and conditions ideals, but I think that what separated Timex and other institutions out was we understood the broader consequences of our actions. And it was about that progressive change at a societal level and not just at a kind of micro factory level.
And I think as well, Charlie, that in Dundee, there's always been a level of class consciousness, right? And I think that's really important when we look at what happened with Timex and the broader community. Like we say, everybody had a Timex watch. Mm-hmm. Nobody has one now, right? And nobody would ever have one now. But we were all seen as part of the same struggle, if you like, that people identified with workers who had gone to defend their wages, who'd gone to defend their conditions of service, and they could relate to that. So whether you were a teacher like me, whether you were a council worker sweeping the streets, you could say, wait a minute, if they get away with what they're trying to do at Timex, then they can get away with anything. And it was within the context of the anti-trade union legislation that Thatcher had brought in, the miners' strike 10 years previous. And that's where the support group, in fact, learned a lot of its trade, because many of us had been involved as a support group for the miners' strike before it. And there was that sense in Dundee that we're part of something much bigger, that we're not just atomized, we're not just individuals or singular workplaces, but that collectively were part of something important. And that was a class thing for me.
I think the class thing is really important to relate to. And I think that something that's often neglected, and I've used that as part of an analysis when I've been asked about Timex and the events around Timex, is we often forget community solidarity. And it's not just about the place of work, it's about things like living conditions that people have had to put up with. You know, we had the rent strikes, we've had tenants movements, so there is a community solidarity, I think, that feeds into the factory. And when you get the political solidarity, I think that then comes back to the communities. And I think that's the sense of political education dynamic. It's this to and fro between community and work, and how we learn about shared values, and we develop a shared culture, and we look after each other. And that's, no matter, we might not have met the person before, but we just understand that. I actually said to a senior manager who was talking about investing in Dundee, and I said, there's 3 words if you hear in Dundee that you should be careful of. And he said, what's those 3 words? And I said, it's no fair.
Okay, you're dead right, Charlie. And that's something that, you know, the multinationals, transnationals, the bosses, if you want to just call it that collective term, they can never understand that. They'll, and that's why we're much stronger than they can ever be, because it's something beyond their comprehension, that people are prepared to work for each other without a profit motive, without something being in it for them. It's about basic humanity. It's about workers recognising dignity is necessary for other workers, as well as for themselves.
I think the symbolism is not lost when you actually think about, and it's interesting about the fact this is Duncan of Jordan, you know, it's an event about art and about representation. And I think that one of the first things that happened during the 1993 dispute was that there was a clothesline hung between trees, and the overalls of the women were pegged onto that. And that was a metaphor about hanging your dirty washing out in public. And so there was that. There was also the artistic element of this as well. And there was so many profound metaphors and evidence on the picket line. There was quotes from Henry III. There was all sorts of things.
Do you remember Timex Intifada right across the caravan? Brilliant.
Yeah, well, it was Tim Intifada, not Timex Intifada. And that was because the author of the Timex, he wanted to paint Timex Intifada, but he ran out of paint. So he put Intifada first, and it was left with Tim Intifada. And it was kind of like people referenced that as a Celtic thing, but it was actually he ran out of paint. I know the person that was doing it. No, there was that, as I said, there was that understanding working class consciousness, that metaphor that hung over that factory gate for the entire time of the dispute was a symbol of particularly working class women in Dundee, you know, definitely telling people what's not acceptable.
And then just to touch on that, because you're thinking about, for someone who didn't know the details of the 1993 dispute, we've kind of discussed it slightly, but what was the key story of the dispute in 1993, the final dispute, but also what could you give any insight into the situation leading up to that?
Yeah. I think that the situation leading up to that is we had a change in management structure. We had a new director appointed in Peter Hall, who made it his personal business to, and I remember speaking to him when I was working on night shift, where he said, this is about deunionising the plant. Workers don't want to be members of the trade unions. He described himself as a child of the Thatcher generation. He boasted about the defeat of the miners, etc. And he was coming there with a purpose, and that was to deunionise the plant. A plant that had been unionised for over 30 years. That was his purpose. And I warned him at the time and said, look, you don't understand Dundee culture. And he pressed ahead. And so the origins of the dispute were, the company massively ramped up its production so it could create a window of opportunity to take on the trade union. And what it did was it decided to introduce a 6-month layoff for 50% of the workforce. But that layoff would be at the basis, be at the behest of managers. Managers would choose who would be laid off and who wouldn't be laid off. And surprise, surprise, anybody who was vocal was being laid off. But there was another dimension to it as well, which I think was one of the critical mistakes that Peter Hall made. The elderly part of the workforce, that constituent group that worked for 20, 30, 40 years for a company they identified with, that they loved working with, they were suddenly gone and a more flexible, younger workforce was brought in. And the idea was that this new malleable workforce would be more likely to accept the conditions imposed by management. Now, the trade union position was quite simple. If, say, myself and Mary worked on the same job, rather than Mary being laid off for 6 months, we would both share 3 months of hardship each. We'd be week on, week off. But management would not accept that. They also introduced a 10% cut in wages and conditions, which clearly was an attempt to engineer the dispute that took place. And on January 29th of 1993, we had a meeting of the employees after a ballot, democratic ballot, in which 98% of people said they were prepared to take industrial action. We took industrial action. And it's quite surreal because people have got a perception about a strike as being something that's kind of opportunistic. It's not. It's the culmination of frustration at something that was so unfair. And when you actually leave that factory that's kind of been part of your identity for years and decades, suddenly you're outside and it's surreal. You're in a struggle and you don't know where that struggle is going to lead. So that was the background to the dispute. We negotiated in good faith with the company. We attempted to get a resolution to the strike in February. The company came back with even more cuts to pay and conditions. And we said we were still prepared to go and discuss that with the company. We voted to end the strike. Now, I remember taking our colleagues back on the 16th of February to be met by lines of police officers. And they were aggressive in how they handled the workers that day. And we were told on no uncertain terms by the police, you're not coming back.
It's absolutely shocking, isn't it? I mean,
well, when you think about it, sorry, Stella, I'm of an age where you've got to get things out of your head very quickly. But when you think about it, these were working class Dundonians who'd never put a foot wrong in their life. If you never paid your council tax, it was a sign of shame. If you got into debt, it was a sign of shame. And yet they were met as they attempted to return to work by lines of police officers. What does that say?
Yeah, and it's one of the lessons that people learn, isn't it? That the state will end up defending the business, defending the capital, rather than protecting the workers. And I think that's something we'll come on to later on, because even when the scab workforce were going into the factory, the police actually ended up protecting thieves, because they were people who were stealing other people's jobs. And you know that when you're faced with that for the first time, that kind of injustice for the first time, it really is an eye-opener for you. And again, about going on strike, I don't think, if you've never been on strike, then you don't understand what it's like, because it's not a gung-ho, here we go kind of feeling. You're filled with all sorts of mixed emotions, right? You're filled with adrenaline, you're filled with anxiety, you're filled with concern about your future. How are you going to pay the rent? How are you going to feed the bairns? I mean, it is as fundamental as that. And so these workers, 98% of them voting to go on strike, that was not done lightly. And it was done, as Charlie says, as a result of a sort of determined attitude on part of the bosses to push them so far that they were going to say, wait a minute, we're human beings, we're not going to take this anymore.
Definitely. And I think what we are talking about here, especially with that kind of, you can do everything right, and then the bosses will still catch you out. We are seeing so many examples of this right now during the pandemic, with multinational and smaller companies using a terrible freak circumstance of a pandemic as an excuse to fire and rehire people on reduced terms and conditions or mass redundancy. And I think this is why this is so pertinent, in my opinion. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to open the discussion up a little bit about the role of politicisation while on strike, as we began to talk about on the picket line. And maybe Mary, you could lead off with that as your involvement with the support group.
Yeah, it was absolutely incredible, right? There was a cauldron of political activity. Every group across the country, every left group across the country and beyond wanted to show solidarity, and they came onto that picket line. And you had this plethora of left-wing newspapers and journals and leaflets being handed out, but as well as being handed out, they were actually being read as well, right? So people were soaking up a lot of stuff. Now, the workforce were nobody's fools, though, and they very quickly could determine any groups that were there just to increase their own membership and stuff like that. But and they could also determine groups that were there who wanted to be involved in an educational process alongside the workforce and the pickets, etc. So it was quite an incredible time for everybody. It was a real time of heightened political awareness and raising a class consciousness, I think, for everybody involved. You know, you can have all the theories in the world, but it's only once the action is taking place that theories can be tried and tested, and that people can see, wait a minute, this works, this doesn't work. But people began to see their place in the world, right? They began, I think, to understand that the world's quite a small place, and it's ruled by very few people, and that the people with the power are very often the people with the money, and that their labour, that they had been working for decades, as Charlie says, that their labour had been used to make the profits for this massive company. And at the end of the day, they could be discarded like that. They were disposable. They weren't human beings. They didn't have families. The company had no loyalty to them whatsoever. So in terms of political education, there was meetings going on about everything. There was basic Marxist classes taking place. There were meetings about Cuba going on. There was stuff about Palestine. And so people were beginning to see the interconnectedness of struggles, I think, across the piece. So it was really a wonderful time in many ways for political debate and discussion to be taking place.
I mean, I think Mary's perfectly correct. And you look at that point in time, I think that political education was always a key function of the trade union movement within Timex. I mean, I remember when I first got elected as a shop steward, when I was a 20-year-old, and I remember every Monday morning we'd have to sit around a big table, and it'd be a big pot of tea, and you would be asked about a particular subject, a particular topic, and you had to, speak about that, and you were grilled. I mean, I remember hearing about the Armenian Azerbaijan conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I was I've never heard of these places before, but I was listening to people who were schooled in Marxism. I was listening to debates between Stalinists and Trotskyists, and so my political education was quite formal in that sense, but it actually diffused into the factory. It diffused into the factory because we were talking about context and about why everything comes back to context, and that context was always about the separation, about the theories of surplus value, for example, that it doesn't matter what we do, they just want more from us. And it grew to become a realization in 1983 of the beginnings of globalization, when Timex decided to move the work some of the work from Dundee to France. And we began to understand the drift towards deregulation, to reduced workers' rights. And I think 93 was a real, not awakening, I think it was a journey that people were on anyway. And I think that's what led, that diffused political education is what led to activism, political activism. And Mary's absolutely right. What we saw, and I remember one quote from one of the employees saying, "My husband used to say I was a poodle. Now he says I'm a pit bull." We were sending people all over the country, people who'd never been involved actively in politics, but had a political understanding. We're traveling the length and breadth of this country, talking to trade union groups, talking to Labour Party groups, talking to other political groups, and not from a position of a kind of nervousness or shyness, but from a position of confidence. And I think that confidence came through, as I said, that diffusion of political education that took place over a number of years, which is often not recognised, but does take place. And I think trade unions are absolutely pivotal when it comes to that political education. At the end of the day, we do not take action as a consequence of whim. We understand context, and we understand what happens if we don't take action, and the broader implications it could have, not just for us, but for other people, other workers across our communities. So I think that the political education, the political activism that was displayed at Timex was a consequence of decades of political education, which was diffused and not always overt in the kind of stuff that I got as a trade union shop steward, and that political education in the discourse of Marxism, etc., that it was much more diffused and subtle. But again, it was also linked to community, because those conversations did not just occur in Timex, they took place in communities. They took place with people sharing the stories about what it was like to work in Timex and what it was like to work in other factories, and how they saw similarities about the motivations of the employers in terms of what they were trying to eke out of labour in terms of profitability.
I think too, Charlie's right, that both of us, we're involved in a kind of formal education setting, or have been during our working lives, right? But, and I do think that's important. I do think education is valuable and necessary and a way out of so many different things. Critical thinking is so important. And it's important to learn from folk that know stuff, but we all know stuff, right? And we can learn from each other. And I think that type of education, the education that takes place in the factory, in the communities, on the streets, at the bus stops, that kind of education of learning for each other is so undervalued. It's dismissed by the hierarchies that rules us. And I believe it's dismissed because they fear it. They fear the fact that when people get together and start discussing with one another and start talking with one another, they're going to come to a conclusion that the world is ill divided, that things are wrong and need to change. And I think that puts shivers up the spine of the ruling classes.
I think also they don't understand the intellectualism of the working class.
No, they don't.
I mean, when I think about the people who schooled me, and I was really, really privileged to be schooled by people who were giants in the labour and trade union movement in Scotland. But I would listen to political discourse. I would listen to political theory. That if these people were teaching at a university, if they were lecturing in political economy and sociology, they would be right at home. But because in those days, you didn't go. If you were working class, you didn't go to university. You weren't afforded the opportunity to go to university. But they were scholars.
Absolutely.
They were scholars. They studied, they read, and they articulated in a way that, to this day, I admire. I feel really, really privileged to have been schooled by these individuals. And I think it shaped my values and it shaped my ability to think critically. And I think in my role as a university lecturer now, I think that I learned probably more about critical thinking then than I did in my time in university.
Definitely.
I think that's so true. And I think it's very true as well that in terms of thinking about political consciousness, we often talk about why do people not vote? Why do people not engage in politics? But actually, we don't think about how politics could apply to people's lives and their work. So it's the most powerful thing when someone realizes that actually, if everyone worked together in a business, in a workplace, we could run it a lot better than the boss. That is the most powerful thing and that is Marxism 101 in action. And it's much more, people can read all the books they like, and intellectualism is incredibly important. But typically at the same time, if you can't apply that in your life, if you can't talk to other people about it and engage, it kind of sits as theory and doesn't turn. And I thought it was really interesting. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the kind of roles and activity that went on the picket line specifically. We mentioned it a bit, but there were lots of, it was kind of a hive of political education and activity. So could you say a little bit more about what happened on the picket line?
Well, obviously the situation is fluid. In the first couple of weeks, you're thinking about when you're going to be going back to work. So there is just the kind of maintenance of semblance of order. But I think that once the die was cast and the company had taken the action it did to lock out, I think that we understood that the tradition, I often said this was a postmodern dispute, because what we understood was that the traditional structures of trade unionism, having a kind of democratic centralist leadership where the convener sits over the stewards and the stewards, that couldn't work, and it couldn't sustain a dispute which was obviously political in nature. So we moved to a very fluid strike committee, which was where it was a participative leadership, where anybody could come in and take part, bring ideas, have those ideas tested, and actually form campaigns that they could become part of leadership of. And I think the classic one I always relate to is the time that some women came to the strike committee to say their work that they traditionally did had been transferred to Besançon in France. And they said, what are you going to do about it? And the convener at the time, John Kidd, said, well, what do you want to do about it? And they said, we want to go and picket in France. So they organised a bus, they organised a sleeping, they bought tents, and they went over to France. These kind of mothers, grannies, sisters, partners, taking part in a piece of action that I've never seen coming out of Dundee. It was internationalism. They appeared on French TV. They were guests of the CGT in France. This was a group of women who just decided it's no fair, and we're going to do something about it. So I think that the fluidity or the participative nature of the leadership, I think, was really, really important. And that's why I say it's kind of postmodern. The other thing we understood was the power of media. And I think we very, very quickly understood that we should not shy away from the media, but we should engage with the media and put our arguments across. So we mixed political rhetoric with empathy and an understanding of the social story behind Timex. And I think we were hugely successful in that. And it was interesting to see that when Stella said we could do better than the bosses. In the year of the strike, we generated more revenue in terms of solidarity funds than the company had the previous year. So maybe that's just an articulation. Maybe the wrong people were running the factory at that time.
I mean, it's interesting when you go up to a picket line, right? If you're not part of a workforce that's on strike, but you want to go up and show solidarity action, right? You go up, and again, that's something that it's not easy for everybody to do. You think, well, will I be welcomed? Where will I stand? What will I do? How will I relate to everybody that's there? And I think that one of the things on that picket line was how welcoming. Right. I mean, I've gone to picket lines where I've been made to feel like I shouldn't actually be there. They didn't want me to support them, but that was never felt like that at the Timex picket line. You were up there, people would offer you a cup of tea, they would offer you a roll and sausage, they would offer you whatever was on the go, and they would start to talk with you. And that's where a lot of education was happening. Now, people that didn't get on so well on the Timex picket line were folk that went there with an agenda to tell folk what they should be doing, right? That was never going to go down well. And if anybody understands women and understands Dundee women, who were, the backbone of that picket line, then that's no way to introduce yourself or to try to win over somebody to your ideas. And there was that vying for ideas and an ideology amongst the various political groups who were there. But I remember Wendy Cobb saying to me, we'll welcome everybody, right? We'll welcome everybody here, right? As long as they understand that this is our dispute. And that's up where I think the local support group and the other support groups were successful. We never tried to dictate what should be going on within that. We were there when we met weekly in the Trades Council Club, and a member of the strike committee would come along and tell us what was going on. And from that, we would organise our Saturday collections, our leafletings, our going out football matches, whatever it was we were doing to raise consciousness across the city. But we knew that our role was supportive. Now, we could go up there and we could discuss and argue and debate, but at the end of the day, that we were in a supportive capacity. And when you take that, when you go there as a listener and somebody who wants to show solidarity, then you learn as much as anything else. That's an education becomes a broadened out thing, so that as well as thinking, oh, I'm going to go up there and tell them about Marx, or I'm going to go up there and tell them about surplus value or whatever. No, you go up there and you listen and you engage at a human level, and that education benefits everybody.
I think Paul Foote wrote a wonderful piece when he talked about his visit to the picket line, and it was mainly his interaction with the women on the picket line, and it was about the humour and the humility, but also holding people to account. I remember speaking to a group of pickets, women, mainly female pickets. There was only about 5 or 6 of them, and one of them said to me, "I was telling that Jimmy Early that he was wrong." That was the full-time officer. A member of the national executive of the union. I told him he was wrong. And I'll tell you what, I used to take a lot of the early morning meetings, and probably the majority of them, you never got missed.
No.
I mean, we had a caravan, and in the caravan, there was 2 women who used to make toast and tea for everybody. And they would make me sit down and I would get lectures from them about what wasn't going right and what we should be doing and stuff like that. And then they would break into anecdotal stories about how they met Billy Bragg on the picket line. And they told that Billy Bragg, and they made tea and toast for Billy Bragg. And so it was just this, it was an unbelievable event. It was a cultural event, a social event, a political event, all wrapped into one. But it was underpinned by that feeling, that belief that something was wrong.
Yeah.
And that if we didn't stand together to try and right that wrong, then other people would suffer. And I think that's where it comes back to community. It's that understanding that if we let ourselves down, we let everybody down. If we win for everybody. And that's always been the history of working class struggle as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely. I think especially that thinking about the role of community as supporting an industrial struggle is incredibly important, because today people may be getting evicted, they may be denied benefits, they may be dealing with asylum issues about the right to stay, and all of these are different ways which by different forces, landlords, the state, working class people are subjugated and are oppressed, and I think that when we combine these different forces in the community, trade unions, I think it's an incredibly powerful thing, because it's a unified message, and it's incredibly powerful. I think also I'd like to kind of think about what do you think, so the wider ramifications of this solidarity and community activism on the picket line. Do you think, we kind of touched on it a bit, but do you think that it increased people's confidence? Do you think be more articulate? What do you think the kind of that impact was on Dundee?
I think it did have a significant impact in terms of the confidence. Obviously, it was a setback the way the dispute ended, and we went through a period of kind of reflection and negative press, and we were accused of being wreckers of jobs and stuff like that. Absolutely not. We were trying to defend people's jobs and wages and conditions. So I think there was a bit of a reaction to that. But as we now are moving in, we now are in a post-industrial economy. And we have moved away from the kind of large factories where that solidarity and that political power was evident. But what we're seeing, I think what we're seeing in terms of community is something else is beginning to happen. I think the communities are becoming far more confident in understanding the context. It may be that it's a particular context they understand. And I'm looking at things like anti-poverty groups that are starting up. I'm talking about the recognition of food poverty in Dundee. I'm talking about the groups that are emerging to talk about suicides, mental health problems. And there's a lot of really, really confident groups emerging who are making their voices heard. And I think if you look at the mental health issues and you look at the campaign around having the 24-hour mental health clinic, that came through community. Yeah. Yes, politicians were involved in the development of it and maybe the kind of allocation of resources, but that came as a consequence of community action. But that's based on community experience. That's based on an experience of context, and that we cannot sit back and just allow other people to fix it for us. We're capable of fixing it ourselves, but we've got to make our voices heard. And I think I'm actually really, really confident about the future of community going forward, because I'm seeing the outcomes of community groups expressing themselves in so many different ways. But what they're doing is the same thing that we did. They understand context. They understand why these situations occur. And that is part of the political education process. Things like poverty are not accidents. Okay. They are the choices that are made by politicians, and they're the outcomes of an economic system that leads to poverty. Mental health crisis is not an accident. It's a consequence of the dynamics of modern living and an underfunding of the services to support that. So there's lots and lots of things that we are seeing communities getting involved in, but there's a single underlying flaw. A single underlying thing, and that is context. The context of the way we live today is having an impact on our families, our communities, and our lives. And I think they're seeing a new level of articulation coming through at the community level, but also at a bigger political level when we think about things like the Black Lives Matter movement, Extinction Rebellion. That is a consequence of political education. And I'm quite heartened when I see this, When I saw the school kids on strike in Dundee City Square, I was heartened that a new generation of people are understanding context and understanding the unfairness of the context in which we exist today, and that we need to challenge that context for the benefit of the majority, not the benefit of the few. I sounded like Jeremy Corbyn there, but I wasn't trying to.
I couldn't agree more, Charlie. I was particularly thinking about food poverty when you were speaking, but also about Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, women wanting to reclaim the streets, right? Mm-hmm. Direct action is back on the agenda as far as I can see, right? The idea that people are prepared to take direct action in order to highlight injustice, in order to right wrongs, is right back on the agenda. And I think, nothing, Charlie's right, it's context, but nothing happens in isolation. We've got to look back through our history, through working class history, through the series of struggles that we've all been through at different points in our lives. And hopefully we can come to a conclusion, wait a minute, that there's something that unites all of this. And that's that there is something wrong with the way we live at the moment. The system that we live under is flawed. It's useless. It serves a minority of people rather than, as Charlie says, serving the majority. And if we come to that conclusion, then we've got to change it. And the fact that so many young folk, and for me, so many young women are getting involved in things at the moment, it is great. I love to see that flame being carried on through the generations and taken forward that way.
And just on a footnote to that, if you look at these groups that we've talked about, Extinction Rebellion, Reclaim the Streets, Black Lives Matter, if you actually get demonized in the Daily Mail, as these groups are at the moment, then you're doing something right as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely. I think there's something interesting there as well, because I think many young people get involved with politics today through social movements and campaigns, whereas perhaps people might be more in the past, more likely to just get involved through their workplace in an organised union. And I think that the reason I'm so interested in Timex is because I think that my generation can learn a lot from the industrial side of trade unionism, how people can get power. But I also think that combined trade unions and social movements and community campaigning each have something incredibly important. So I don't know what you think of that in terms of the way that people have interacted with politics has maybe changed, but
I think it has. And I think that one of the things that I learned from Timex, or certainly from 1993, people don't want to be led. People can lead. So what we saw was this transformation of the political, if you like, order in Timex. And we, as I said, we moved from this traditional model to a more participative model, and people wanted to lead. They didn't want to be told. They didn't want to be told every day, this is what we're going to be doing, this is who we're writing to, this is who we're lobbying. They want to be part of that. So I think, again, it comes back to, if you look at the history of Dundee, Dundee has got a fascinating history. If you go back to the suffragette movement, Dundee women didn't want to be told what they needed to do. They went and did it. They involved themselves in direct action. Some of them found themselves in prison in Perth and were force-fed and tortured. So the idea that people need to be led, I think that Timex began to show that people lead. And it's all about that connection with, and I keep going back to it, it's about the connection with the context and connection with community. And what we've got is leaders emerging from all over the place. And if we thought that a young woman would actually create the conditions of the Extinction Rebellion, or the focus, despite the abuse that she took from the right-wing press, who would have thought that a young person at less than 16-year-old could lead a global movement? And I think these are really, really positive things. And I think that there's leaders every place. We've just got to let them lead.
I also think that obviously something that's very different from the time that Charlie and I are talking about specifically is social media. Mm-hmm. And the power of social media and the ability of young people and people like yourself, Stella, right? People who have been involved in this project to use social media for an educational tool to draw people together, to communicate across the world. I think it is phenomenal You know, sometimes I kind of get my camera right, but I'm trying really hard to engage with this. But it's definitely the way forward in terms of communication, mass communication. There are dangers with it, obviously, real dangers, but young folk tend to be a lot more politically savvy about how to use social media than my generation certainly is.
I think Mary made the point. My name now is Charlie, you're on mute. Like many people, I just don't know how to work the technology, but I think we've done well. We've managed to stay online and not fade from or get lost. So, we keep trying, Mary.
Yeah.
we keep trying. I think that Stella, the Better Than Zero campaign, was an absolute example. And that was to look at the rights of people in 0 hours contracts to try and improve the rights. When we had things like the flash groups emerging and going into organisations that abused employees' rights and occupying them, and that was always organised through social media. So I think that Mary's right. Social media is a new form of political education, but it's also a new form of political ignorance. And that's what we've got to be careful of.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between political action and political activism. Political activism has its philosophy and its core social progress. And I think what we've learned through the events, particularly in the United States of America, post the presidential election, political action could come as a consequence of political ignorance. And we've got to separate and distinguish between the two.
I think those are very pertinent points. Just before we have a short interval, we've got some nice messages from further education lecturers who have been on strike today who are tuning in, which I think is incredible. So we'd like to definitely extend solidarity to
Absolutely.
Definitely.
all power to you. So we're just going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to come back at about, I'll say 58. 2 minutes to 7, but we've got some a soundtrack that you can enjoy as well while you make a cup of tea or
elevator music.
So yeah, we'll join you back at 2 minutes to 7. Hi everyone, we're just going to start back again now. Just to introduce the next and final section, one area that interests me, both as an artist and also because I have previously worked in precarious employment, is the way that it's not only to do about paying conditions, but it is also about time itself. For example, many workers in hospitality don't get paid for cleaning up or for setting up the bar. Delivery workers, for example, there was a really important article came out today talking about how many workers, the majority of workers in Scotland in delivery, don't get paid minimum wage. We might also think about this as a new phenomenon, but it's not. Actually, even before the Industrial Revolution, workers would demand the right to a sundial in a field because they didn't believe that their boss would tell them the amount of hours that they had worked. So I think there is an irony here as well. We're talking about Timex, which was a watch factory, and also people no longer wear Timex watches in Dundee. And those workers in 1993 were told there was no more hours for them in that very significant industrial dispute. I think that since 1993, as we've kind of touched on, we have seen a mass expansion of the private sector, which has been coupled with poorer pay conditions. That was really being pushed forward from at that point in time. And it is part of that kind of history of deindustrialisation, the rise of the service industry. And people of my generation have inherited a more unequal world. As we discussed, we have seen rising rents, low pay, and we are often expected to do more work in less time. And it's not just in hospitality or in the gig economy. We see this even in universities, in the arts. We see this across sectors. It is kind of one of a founding part of the way that capitalism functions. The reason I mention this in relation to Timex is that I think we can learn important lessons from the resistance that ordinary people showed to that kind of dominance. And I want to hear from the participants to kind of a little bit of reflection, thinking about why do you think it is important to learn about Timex, but not just Timex, about our own working class history as well. Maybe Mary, you could start us off on that.
Sure, Stella. I think it's crucially important that we learn our own history and we learn from our experiences. As Charlie has said before, we're not taught this in school. I think that, for example, the A to Z of Dundee that was the start of this programme, I think that should be in every school in this city because it's such a valuable resource. And we need to work on having that collective memory so that people know what's happened in the past, because then we can see why we're where we are today and where we can learn from it and where we can go. I think there's a tendency for folk to think that this is just the way things are. Right? Things have always been like this. Nothing's going to change. I can't do anything to change it. But if you look at history, if you look at the history of the planet and Homo sapiens on the planet, you'll see that every time change is inevitable. Excuse me, that change has come about and moved things forward, and things can change again. It's how they change that's the important thing. I think that we have to have a realisation that any rights that we have not been given to us generously by the ruling classes, by the ruling elites. Every single right that we've got has been fought for, sometimes with the blood of working class people, right? And that's crucially important to remember that, because those rights, unless we have control, unless we have power, they can be taken away from us at a moment's notice, in the same way that jobs can be taken away from people, that housing can be taken away from people, that the very essentials of life can be taken away from people. So unless we recognise the importance of our collective power and take power ourselves, I know that may sound romantic, revolutionary, whatever, but I actually mean it, because I think it's the only way that this planet is going to survive. I think that it's the only way that we can move forward. And Marx said it's either socialism or barbarism, right? There's choices. You come to a point in the road where you go one way or the other. And I think we're well on the way to that point in the road, and we've got to make a decision collectively to turn our world into something better. And I think one of the lessons that we can learn from Timex is that when people do work together, they can create something that's quite wonderful. That they can create something, a solidarity, a sisterhood and a brotherhood, men and women standing side by side and saying, we will not go and allow this to happen anymore. And so I think that if we understand our collective power, that we can enshrine rights for working class people, and that we can create a different way of living, because that's necessary. Because if we continue with this way of living, then the planet will be destroyed, and in the process of destroying the planet, we will see communities destroyed further, and we will see human beings reduced to the very basics of existence, unless we fight back and say, no, we're not going to let this happen. I didn't mean to sound apocalyptic, right? But it's really important, you know. I want to see my kids' generation and any grandchildren's generation. I want to see a world for them that's a better place. Not, as you said, the world for you is even more unequal rather than it was for us. That's shocking. What a failure what an indictment on our generation. Right, so we need to change that. You need to change it and make sure that doesn't happen for the next generation.
I mean, again, it's some of the things about history repeating itself. I mean, the whole concept of a reserve army of labour is nothing new. And if you actually look at the euphemism flexibility that kind of dominated the economic landscape of the 1980s, it was about being able to create the conditions where employers could discard employees and treat them as casual labour. And that's no different from when we talked about the reserve army labour in the industrialisation days. The times in the mills in Dundee where people would queue up at the gates to be selected to come into work and let go whenever, you know, the situation demanded it or the demand necessitated it. But what we've got is a far more, if you think about it, managers have never had the right to hire and fire at will, the kind of freedoms they've got in that at the present. And yet, what has been the consequence of this? Has it led to an increase in terms of productivity across the UK? No, it's not. If you go back to 2009 and you look at the growth statistics, the UK economy is flatlined. So despite all these emerging powers that managers have, the managerial prerogative, the right to hire and fire, flexibility, 0 hours contracts, we've never seen any gains to the economy. What we have witnessed, though, is growing inequality, disgusting growing inequality. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk to see who's the most multi-billionaire person on the planet, where Amazon can see their profits go, or their share value go up by $124 billion in a week during a pandemic, and probably because of a pandemic. So whilst the employers have got these rights, it's not been good for the economy. It's not been good for equality. And when it's not good for equality, then it's not good for social harmony. And the outcome, the consequences here in Dundee are quite stark. In areas like Lochee, there are 30% of children living in poverty. There are people going to food banks, and the increase in food banks is at record levels. And food banks cannot keep up with the demand. This is the 21st century. This is supposed to be a modern economy, and yet people are reduced to traveling miles to get very basic food subsidies in order to keep them going. It's appalling, it's abysmal. So the model isn't working. And whether or not we see a more radical kind of view of what that model should look like that Mary was espousing, or something different. But what I am seeing, and that's why I keep coming back to this, what I'm seeing at community level is people are saying, nah, we're not putting up with this. We're not getting this. The system isn't supporting us. So we're going to start advocating for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And as I said, things like the Mental Health Crisis Centre here in Dundee, that pressure has came about by individuals who've watched their families suffer. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I've got optimism for the future. So I've maybe wandered away from your point a little bit, Stella, but I think it's part of a bigger whole. I think that the ideology has not changed. It's intensified, but it's no good. In terms of inequality, in terms of the economy, and in terms of society and community, it's not working.
I tell you what's interesting though, Charlie, as well. Well, that despite the fact, possibly because of, but despite the fact that these terrible things are happening, what we're seeing in our communities are people banding together.
Yeah.
You know, the larders that are springing up, the food banks that are springing up. Yes, some of them are run by religious institutions, but others are coming from the community upwards, and we're seeing working class folk looking after working class folk.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw in the Timex, you know, and with that kind of support group, that support mechanism. You see parallel structures being created. The state is not managing to provide for the citizens, so the citizens will provide for each other. So structures are being created at grassroots level.
And at the end of the day, it's humanity
Absolutely.
that underpins it. It's that that joint understanding of context and humanity,
going hungry
and that kind of social solidarity, organic solidarity, community solidarity, and yes, political solidarity, all coming together. There's a struggle taking place. It's maybe not reaching the headlines in the newspapers and the media and the tabloids, but there is a struggle taking place in communities. And I think there's an emancipation in communities. I mean, I go to the Porterbank Community Garden here in Lochee, and it's exactly as Mary described. Working class people growing vegetables for working class people and supporting them to make sure that when it comes to winter, everybody's got a pot of soup. And that's no different from when I was a kid. It shows a lack of social progress. That I was born in 1960, and I'm still seeing that dependence on community to feed bairns. It's not right.
Oh, no, it's heartbreaking.
I think Timex tells us a little bit about that, but I think that it's about that idea of community, organic solidarity and social solidarity, and how people look out for each other. And it wasn't just Timex, it was probably in every single factory in Dundee.
I think one thing that really struck me about the Timex dispute in 1993 was like the intense amount of organisation on the picket line, community solidarity. There was an incredible amount of work that people put into that. And I think I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but I think we can really learn from that, because we are seeing some really incredible stuff going on. There's encouraging stuff for sure. But I also think there was a level of kind of like commitment and also like kind of confidence that we can really take forward that was demonstrated in the Timex dispute. I think today we could perhaps learn from that. What do you think on that subject?
I think you're absolutely right, Stella. I think that what we did in Timex was, and a large amount of credit has to go to the convener of Stuart John Kidd at the time, who just decided to tear up the rule book, to tear up the idea that we waited for solidarity rather than going and getting that solidarity. And there was a machine built. There was an organisational machine built that, as I said, allowed us to send people all over the UK to transfer our message, but to the United States of America, to Denmark, to Norway, to France. What we did, it was an operation that allowed us to sustain people in an industrial dispute for months, several months. And what we as I said, we tore up the rule book. We often fell foul of the trade union, who didn't like some of the activities we were involved in, but it was because we understood on the ground what was happening and what we needed to do to sustain people who were engaged in an industrial dispute. And it goes back to something Mary said earlier on. We were prepared to welcome anybody as long as they understood they came within the discipline of the strike committee. It was our dispute, and they were welcome to show solidarity, but it was about us. But I think there was a phenomenal organisation that was built up. And as I said, we tore up the rule book. We understood that we needed to generate revenue. Where was that revenue going to come from? So we allowed people to experiment and create. And as I said, the revenue we had coming in was phenomenal, and the support we received. Remember, this is 312 people on a hill in Dundee, and yet we ended up in the United States of America with the leaders of the Communication Workers Union of all countries. I was sitting next to the Vice President of Solidarity at a dinner, and he was talking about the kind of events that were happening in Poland, and he asked me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm on strike in Dundee." Where's Dundee? It's a wee hill in Dundee. We're on strike against American multinational company. So it was phenomenal, the operation. And I think there's a lot we can understand about that the importance of operation. And again, I could point to a local dispute, the Brassica dispute, for example, and about the coordination in the operation of that dispute and how it brought people together from different aspects in a very difficult situation. But again, there was also the emancipation of the people who were involved in that and how these individuals as well became leaders in their own right by taking their arguments forward. So I think that's the thing we've got to understand. There are, as I said, there are leaders every place. We've got to create the conditions that allow that leadership to flourish.
I think, Stella, in answer to your question about, where do you get the confidence from, etc. I mean, it doesn't just come, right? It comes via people supporting one another, right? To do stuff. It's a case of saying, I need to speak at this meeting. How am I going to do it? Can I do it? Will I be able to do it? And your colleagues, your friends saying, you can. I'll come with you. I'll hold your hand. I'll take you there. I'll hold your hand while you speak if you need to. And that kind of physical support is something that gives people confidence. And once you've done it, you can do it again. And the structures start to emerge. It's organic. I mean, things just start to grow and it shoots out. And that happens, Charlie, you're right. It happens when there aren't any leaders, right? There was no leader of the support group, right? There was no leader coordinating all the support groups. The people just were working together. And if somebody was good at speaking or needed encouragement for speaking, they would get a speaking job. If somebody was good at going and finding stuff out for other people, they would get that kind of job. And it's a bit like what happens in prisons, isn't it? You have your fixer, you have this people that do all sorts of different things in order to make it work for the folk. And when you realise that you're not alone, that's what gives you the confidence that you will always have somebody there that's got your back. That can give you the confidence to do amazing things. And Charlie's right, what they did was phenomenal, right? It was miraculous to see folk for a wee hill in Dundee, 300 people, and what they achieved in terms of getting their message out there and in terms of encouraging international solidarity. That's what you can do when you get back each other up.
Anecdotally, and I'm not going to say too much more because I think I'm speaking too much already, but anecdotally, I used to tell the story about two young women who were active on the picket line, had never been engaged in public speaking before, and we had an invitation from the TUC who had the Blackpool conference, and I asked them to go down and speak at the Winter Garden, and they said, "What's the Winter Garden?" And I said, "It's a pub in Blackpool." It turned out to be the venue of a 2,000-person conference. They managed that, and it had a transformational impact on them. Again, though, it's not just the people who hold your hand, it's the people who've been through it themselves and understand what it was like that first time. You stood on a stage and spoke to people, or you held a meeting and spoke to people. And that's what solidarity is about. It's not a charity. It's about that understanding of experience and shared experience and giving support and encouragement to each other. And I think, again, going back to the Better Than Zero campaign and again to Brassica, I think these are classic examples of where that solidarity led to the development of leadership within.
Definitely. I'm just gonna, unless there are any points you would like to make before we move to questions. I think
there's just one thing I was thinking about, right, when we were talking about education in terms of, we all got educated, the workers, the supporters, etc. But there was also an education there for the SCAB workforce as well, right? They came to understand that if they chose to betray folk within their own class, that they would be vilified, right, by the community, and that they would be pariahs virtually forever. But they also came to learn that the minute the management had used them, they too would be discarded, right? And that's something I think that we've got to face up to in terms of our class, that people will try to divide us. And when you can understand why people might choose to scab if they're in dire economic circumstances, but you've got to also understand the consequences of what that does, and that by scabbing on your brothers and sisters who are in struggle, then you're committing a heinous crime that will not easily be forgiven unless lessons are learned. by those involved in that as well.
Definitely. I think it's a classic tactic, isn't it, of divide and rule. And obviously there will always be, there might always be a small amount of people that don't form a united front. But I think that we can definitely, we can learn how to maximise that to the most that we can by building broad, campaigns that link people with completely different backgrounds together. I'd have some questions that I'm gonna put to you. So this one, either of you can take it if you want, or you can both answer. This is from Alan Hooligan, or is it Hooligan? I don't want to call you a hooligan if that's not how you say your second name. He asks, formal / secondary education, the system places emphasis on employability, but not on issues of exploitations or workers' rights. Do you think it could ever be possible to embed workers' rights into the curriculum?
Oh, definitely. There's room within that. I mean, within social education classes, within social studies classes as well, that there's an absolute space for that to be taught. Political education, there's a space for that to be taught in every secondary school. It's not, sadly, taught, right? And sometimes but we get our people who'll say, oh, you can't teach about politics in school because that'll be bias. What a piece of nonsense. It's bias already, right? What we need is to develop parts of the curriculum where that can be taken forward. And I really do think, Alan, that's something that's vitally important. We see 16-year-olds about to vote in the Scottish Parliament elections. It's appalling that they've not had any political education. Many of them haven't had any political education through their schooling. I mean, there's a lot wrong with the school curriculum and that could be changed. The TUC has worked on modules for classes that could be adapted, could be used in every school at the drop of a hat. What you need is the political will to do it.
I think I would agree with Mary that there is space within the curriculum, obviously, for looking at things like workers' rights and looking at things about the environment and about community. I think that one of the things we could point to throughout the history of education is there's always been that part of our education that's not been taught, and that's our part. And I think there's always space for that. But I think that we shouldn't regard education as just being something passive, where the pupils sit passively and are told, what they've got to learn. I think that what we've seen, and again, I'm going to go back to the Extinction Rebellion. I think what and Mary's point about social media, I think young people are far more in tune with what's happening within the world than perhaps any generation previously. And we're seeing that manifest itself in action by pupils at school, which we haven't seen. And that's why I said I'm really incredibly excited about the future going forward, because we have got that generation. But Alan's point is quite correct. That there is one dimension that we teach. There's one element we teach, and it's the element that's about and that part about employability. I've got to be very careful here because as a university lecturer, I'm about to say something very controversial, but it's almost like we're trying to create plug and play citizens, people who come through an education system that are designed to be able to plug into the system and to continue to operate on behalf of the system rather than perhaps recognize the system as faulty. And what we need is people to come through as critical, creative thinkers and say, you know what, we can do it a different way. And I'm far more optimistic about that going forward. And I think we're seeing that in struggle and how struggles manifest itself in much more micro ways than the kind of large structural ways in which we engaged in struggle. But I think Alan's point is absolutely valid. But it's something, Alan, I'm afraid that was the same kind of conversation I was having when I was 16 at school. Why are we not getting taught the stuff that's relevant to us?
Definitely. I think it's so true as well because, we can do what we want outside of school and we can reach a certain amount of people. Or also the STUC, for example, run a Unions into School programme, which does great work. But why do people have to volunteer to do that into schools? But also that there is also so much knowledge that can be learned outside of school. And also the point about employability is incredibly important because people are effectively, being prepared for a world of exploitation, and we have to tackle that at the root. We have to give people the tools to challenge that if if they're being treated unfairly. Another question I have is from Jenny Gunn, and that she's asking, how do so many young people involved in movements like Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion, how do we get them to join unions and be actives in their workplaces? So I'll just leave that open to use.
I think it's evolutionary. I think that what happens is, I think we all remember the day when we first became involved in politics. I don't think we ever saw ourselves as being the shop stewards of the future or anything like that. There was a kind of an ideological frustration. Something wasn't right, and we were opposed to it. And as over a period of time, as you develop that confidence, I think that confidence then translates itself into leadership when it comes to people in the workplace. And I think that what comes out of your experience becomes that confidence, maturity. I'm not saying that young people aren't mature, because I was a shop steward at 20-year-old. I was a young person when I became a shop steward. And it was a frightening experience, I have to say. But it's just that I think it will happen. And I think if you look at some of the movements, particularly if you look at the United States in terms of social responsibility and stuff like that, it came as a consequence of the baby boomers, realizing that there was a different necessity that they experimented with drugs, and music changed, and they became the voters of the future. So I think that it's an evolutionary thing. I don't think we should put too much pressure on. I think we should allow young people to explore their context, explore their ideologies, or what they think needs to change. And I think that the leadership will come once they've had an experience. I sat on a bus coming back from one of the Extinction Rebellion meetings, and there was two young women with placards on the bus. I'll not say what the one that said about Donald Trump, I'll not say what that one said, because there was a couple of expletives in there. But these young women will go on it and become something. I'm quite confident in that.
Yeah, in terms of trade unions, though, and getting young people to join trade unions, I do think that the official trade union bodies have got to look at themselves and how they organise, and the trade union leadership, right? For a long period of time, unions were like places where you could get your almost get health insurance and stuff like that, rather than being part of a political, educational struggle that all of us have been involved in. So I think that there needs to be a bit of a shake-up, especially at the leadership level in a lot of the unions, in terms of how they deal with their members, how they respond to their members, because young people and anybody else has got to see it as valuable for them to pay their hard-earned cash into a union membership. It's got to be relevant to them. And the trade union leadership, I think, needs to open its eyes a wee bit and say, well, wait a minute, how can we change in order to make ourselves as a union relevant to the lives of these workers who are struggling at the moment?
I think that Mary makes a valid point about that. We shouldn't regard young people as being the future subscribers to the union. If we see them just as, it's almost like, let's have a membership drive to attract people in to pay their dues, and then that finances the operations of the trade union. I think that relevance, I'm a wee bit more pessimistic than perhaps Mary was, because I remember addressing the Scottish TUC conference and saying exactly that same thing in 1986 when we were talking about the attitudes of trade unions towards young people. So, but I am. The organisation of struggle will change. It won't stay. It won't kind of stay in the same structures that we perhaps have at the moment. And I think that Mary's point is we've got to evolve the structures in order to make ourselves relevant. And I think there's absolute validity in that. But I think that what we'll see a much more fluid approach to struggle. And it might not be through these collective bodies, but through much more micro-based organisations. But as I said, I think that the evolution will be into politics. Whether that's trade union politics or progressive politics, I think the evolution will be into those areas. And so, as I said, I'm a lot optimistic about the future going forward.
Yeah, I think as well that there's the image of the union is very much in my eyes, and this correct me if I'm wrong, but you're talking about old white men running unions, right? And that's
thanks, Mary.
And that's not really, I would imagine, very appealing to a lot of folk who are interested in the kind of struggles that you're talking about, Charlie, the Extinction Rebellion, people and all the rest of it. Where they're going to look at that and think, you know, these guys have been in that position for the last years, oat cake, right? They've been doing it. They've been getting paid big wages for doing it, some of them, and all the rest of it. Why should I subscribe to that? So I think there needs to be a rethink within the unions themselves about their function and how they actually make themselves relevant. And I wasn't meaning you, Charlie.
No, I was. I think I agree with you 100%, Mary. But I was young once.
I think
and I have the pictures to prove it.
I think that's the pertinent point as well, because the areas of growth we see in the trade union movement are in areas are specifically women workers are joining unions more than men are. So our young people are proportionately joining a lot more. I think that that shows the direction of travel. Of course, you will always, like anything, you get people who don't want to change. But ultimately, I think the direction of travel is in that direction. We do need to change in the faces of the trade union movement, but I think some of that change is happening. We just have to keep pushing from it as well. And
again, Stella, I share your confidence about what we're seeing is a reversal of trend in terms of union membership and union density across the UK, and we are beginning to see the growth. And I think that it's the insecurity that drives people to want to have some degree of protection, and they can't get the protection from the state, so they need to get protection from someplace. And I think they're understanding that the security comes through being part of something which gives you a collective strength rather than an individual weakness. So I think that might be accounting for why that's happening. And I think that perhaps with what we're experiencing at the moment, where people start to look at the insecurities they've got and how they can actually build a different future, I think the trade unions are going to become a far more important part of people's thinking than it maybe has been in the past 10 years.
I hope so.
I'm gonna read some comments that people have left, and then I'll end on one final question. So Kate Parker has said that some of the new unions in England and maybe Scotland, I would say definitely there is some work like this happening in Scotland, are doing great work, like IWGB, UVF, winning battles for delivery riders.
Absolutely.
University cleaners, very true, very important. Also, there is some discussion about self-organisation and democratic control of working class organisation as being crucial. Also, just discussing about points about political education, how just agreeing with some of the discussions that we had on earlier on about people learning from one another, realising their own power and agency. So I'm just going to end on one question because I think it's a very good one. Laughing Catty says, I'm sure that's not a real name, but I like it. I feel chronically ignorant in politics and activism, and when I try to build a knowledge base, I feel lost and overwhelmed trying to find credible information. Have you any advice on pushing through? I feel that's a good question to end on, because ultimately, you know, it is incredibly overwhelming getting involved in politics. But I feel like in this discussion, we've unpicked some of that, but maybe we could think about that for the last question.
I think that's a really, really pertinent question. I think it goes back to perhaps what Mary said there about our structure, the trade union structure in particular, evolving to become more accessible to people. So that certainly when it comes to trying to learn, certainly, the political education side of it, and we've said there are steps that are being taken by the TUC and the STUC, but I think that question tells us that we're not doing enough, that people need to understand where they can go to engage with the political education. This isn't about indoctrination. It's about being able to have a critical discussion about as I keep saying, our context and why our context is shaped in the way it is. And I think that's a really pertinent question to end this on. As I said, my political education came not because I joined something in terms of going to university or whatever. It was twofold. It became because I was associated with people who were scholars in the context that I was in, but also the people I worked with and learned from on a daily basis as part of a community. So I hope that the person who's asked the question will find that route into political education. But I think you start a community and start with community groups and start to understand better your context, because it's context and changing context that changes lives.
I think Charlie's dead right. I'm not going to just repeat everything he said, because he's right. I think that it can be so scary wanting to get involved in politics, but feeling overwhelmed, as Kate said, right? Feeling like how do I break through? Everybody else seems to know what they're talking about. Everybody else is using acronyms. Everybody else is using words and referring to historical events that I don't understand. And it is like that to begin with. It can be like that. But it's by talking to other people, it's by events like this, right, where things are talked through, hopefully in a way that's accessible to everybody. And I think that's something that I feel quite strongly about, right? I've tried to read Karl Marx's Capital, right? I'm actually balancing my computer on 3 volumes of it right now. It is indecipherable, and it's absolutely impossible for me. I'm not saying for everybody, for me, just to open up the book and understand what's going on. But I have sat with other people and we've talked through the ideas that are contained within Capital, and they've helped me to understand it. So starting within your community, where you're living, where you're working, being involved with human beings, that's a political education, right? Yeah. Then speaking to other folk about political ideas through events like this, through meetings that you might be able to go to, that's political education. And don't be put off by the fact that at first it can seem baffling, because there will be people there who like to make it seem mystical and mysterious, and that it's only their domain. It's not. It's your domain, it's our domain, and it's something that affects, it's all of our lives that we're talking about. So I think it's really important to get involved, talk to other folk, join in events and things, and that's where your political education and understanding comes from, and the rest follows on.
I think the other thing we've got to remember is when it comes to politics, people think it's very serious all the time, but political education and political participation is actually great fun as well. You meet some fantastic people, and I've met Stella through politics and political action. I met Mary far too long ago for either of us to want to kind of acknowledge, but you meet great people and you get victories. Yeah. And with every victory, every little victory, you move forward with your confidence. And I would say, what I said before and what Mary said, get involved in something local to begin with, but it's great fun. You'll experience lots of great things. You'll engage in struggles. You'll get your heart broken when things go against you. But that sense of pride you get of actually trying to change things will live with you forever.
I think that's very true. And I think it's a very important point, because as you say, it can be very alienating, life itself. You know, it's difficult. It can get you down for sure. But I think there's the real anecdote to the kind of harshities of life under capitalism and austerity is solidarity, is meaningful connection with other people, and realizing that we do have more in common with everyone who has to work to survive is the most powerful realization I've ever made, because it made the world and changing things seem possible. There's not to say there's not challenges in that, but I think there are lots of really exciting ways to get involved in politics. It meant like joining community campaigns, such as anti-food poverty action, joining against like joining a tenants union, for example, or a trade union in your workplace and getting involved there, are some really good places to start. But ultimately, I don't think that no matter what level people are at, it is, I think Mary pointed out, it is a tool of kind of control to say that people are not qualified to talk about politics. Everyone is, no matter how informed or not, and it is through our collective conversations that we make people more informed, and we also listen and learn from people with completely different life experiences to us. So I think we're going to wrap it up here, but I think this has been
can I finish very quickly on a cliche? It's not a cliche, but it's a quote from Mary Mead, and it's that classic anthropologist statement: never ever underestimate the ability of a small group of dedicated people to change the world.
Yeah.
Indeed, it's always been thus.
Yeah. That's very true. Definitely. And as it was pointed out as well, every change that we have had has been fought for by some sort of organised group of people, vast majority of that working class people. So there is no reason to say that every one of us can't play a role in future changes to come. So just to wrap up there, I've certainly found this discussion really meaningful and worthwhile. I'd like to thank both Mary and Charlie on behalf of the Cooper Gallery, and I really do think that I've really been interested to hear your contributions, and I know from the comments that we've been reading, other people have appreciated it as well. So yeah, I'm just going to end the event here, but I think it's been incredibly interesting, and thank you everyone for attending and playing a role in the discussion. Cheers. Thank you everyone.
Thanks for allowing us to participate.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.